The late August sun beat down on the asphalt of Highway 20 as Dean Crawford leaned into a gentle curve, the rumble of his 2018 Harley-Davidson Road King echoing across the endless Nebraska plains. At 38 years old, Dean had spent the last 15 years of his life on the road, moving from town to town, job to job, living by a code that few people understood anymore. A man's word was his bond, and the open road was the only home he needed. His motorcycle was more than just transportation. It was an extension of himself. The deep black paint job was accented with silver tribal designs that wrapped around the fuel tank and fenders, reflecting his appreciation for heritage and craftsmanship. Chrome exhaust pipes gleamed in the sunlight, and the leather saddlebags on either side carried everything he owned: tools, clothes, camping gear, and a worn journal where he documented his travels. Dean wasn't part of an outlaw motorcycle club. Those days of lawlessness and criminal activity belonged to a different era, one that he had consciously avoided. Instead, he rode with the Iron Brotherhood, a riding club based out of Wyoming that focused on charity work, veteran support, and the simple joy of brotherhood on two wheels. They wore their patches with pride, but their reputation was built on respect and community service, not violence or intimidation. The wind whipped at Dean's leather jacket as he accelerated down a straight stretch of highway. He had left Cheyenne 3 days ago after finishing a month-long job at a custom motorcycle shop, where he had helped restore a vintage 1967 shovelhead. The pay had been good and the work satisfying, but as always, the call of the road had been stronger than any paycheck. Dean was heading east toward Iowa, where another temporary gig awaited him at a friend's farm machinery repair shop. But something about this particular stretch of Nebraska highway felt familiar. The flat expanse of cornfields, the weathered barns dotting the landscape, the small towns with their grain elevators rising like sentinels against the horizon, it all stirred something in his memory. Dean squinted at a road sign as it flashed past. Plainview, 15 miles. Plainview. The name hit him like a physical blow, causing him to ease off the throttle. His heart rate quickened as memories he had buried for 15 years suddenly surged to the surface. Plainview, Nebraska. He had been here before, a lifetime ago when he was a different person. Dean pulled off at the next exit, guiding his bike to the shoulder of a quiet county road. He killed the engine and sat in silence, the ticking of cooling metal the only sound besides the whisper of wind through the corn. He removed his helmet and ran a hand through his short, dark hair, now peppered with gray at the temples. 15 years ago, he had been 23, angry, directionless, and running from a family situation that had threatened to destroy him. His father's death from lung cancer, his mother's spiral into alcoholism, his younger sister's drug addiction. It had all been too much. Dean had thrown a leg over his first bike, a beat-up 1995 Sportster he'd bought with the last of his savings, and had ridden away from Oklahoma without looking back. He had drifted north through Kansas, living on the cheap, sleeping in campgrounds and taking odd jobs for cash. By the time he reached Nebraska, he had been down to his last $20, exhausted and questioning every decision he had ever made. That was when he had limped into Plainview with a leaking radiator hose and an empty stomach. And that was when he had met Harold Peterson. Dean's jaw tightened as the memories became clearer. Harold had been in his early 50s then, a sturdy, weathered farmer with kind eyes and hands roughened by decades of hard work. He had been at the local feed store when Dean had rolled up, asking about the nearest mechanic. Instead of just giving directions, Harold had offered something that Dean had desperately needed, but had been too proud to ask for. Help. You look like you could use a meal and a place to stay, Harold had said, his voice carrying the slow, measured cadence of rural Nebraska. I've got work that needs doing on my farm, and I could use an extra set of hands for a few weeks. Room and board, plus a fair wage. What do you say? Dean remembered the suspicion he had felt, the defensive walls he had built around himself. But Harold's offer had been genuine, and Dean had been desperate. He had accepted, telling himself it would only be for a week or two, just long enough to earn enough money to fix his bike and move on. But it had turned into 3 months, 3 months of working dawn to dusk, repairing fences, maintaining equipment, helping with the harvest. 3 months of home-cooked meals and sleeping in a small but clean room above the barn. 3 months of Harold treating him not as hired labor, but almost like a son, teaching him about farming, about patience, about what it meant to build something lasting. Harold had never asked for money up front. "You pay me when you can," he had said. "I trust you." Those words had been revolutionary to Dean, who had grown up in a world where trust was a weakness to be exploited. But then the call had come. His sister Carrie had overdosed. She was in the hospital in Tulsa, and his mother was too drunk to deal with it. Dean had to go. He had left in the middle of the night, leaving only a hastily scribbled note thanking Harold and promising to send payment as soon as he could. He had fully intended to keep that promise, but life had gotten complicated. Carrie survived, but her recovery had been long and painful. Their mother had died 6 months later, cirrhosis of the liver. Dean had been pulled into the role of caretaker, working multiple jobs to pay for Carrie's rehab and keep a roof over their heads. The months had turned into years, and somehow, in the chaos and exhaustion, the debt to Harold Peterson had slipped through the cracks of his memory. Until now. Dean stared at the road sign pointing toward Plainview. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. He had prided himself on being a man of his word, on living by the code of honor that the Iron Brotherhood upheld. But he had broken that code. He had taken Harold's kindness and generosity, and he had failed to repay it. He couldn't remember the exact amount he owed. It had been somewhere around $2,800 for the room, board, and advance pay that Harold had given him. But even if it was a penny, it was a debt of honor. And 15 years of interest made it something he needed to settle. Dean started his bike, the familiar rumble grounding him in the present. He guided the Harley back onto the county road, heading toward Plainview. The Iowa job could wait. This couldn't. The town looked much as he remembered it, a single main street lined with brick buildings, a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and the old feed store where he had first met Harold. The population sign still read 1,247, though Dean suspected the actual number was lower now. Rural Nebraska had been losing population steadily for decades as young people moved to cities for opportunities that no longer existed in small farming communities. Dean parked his motorcycle in front of the diner and walked inside. The bell above the door chimed, and several of the locals looked up with the mild curiosity that strangers always attracted in small towns. The place smelled like coffee and fried food, and the decor hadn't changed since the 1980s. Wood-paneled walls, red vinyl booths, and a counter with stools. A waitress in her mid-50s approached with a pot of coffee and a practiced smile. Her name tag read, Linda. "Afternoon," she said, just passing through. "Actually, I'm looking for someone," Dean said. "Harold Peterson. He has a farm somewhere around here. You know him?" Linda's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of concern. "Harold? Sure, everyone knows Harold. His place is about 6 miles east of town, off County Road 17, but..." She hesitated. "Well, Harold's been going through a tough time lately. Lost his wife Margaret about 2 years ago. Cancer. And the farm's been struggling. Word around town is he might lose the place." Dean's chest tightened. Lose the place. "Why?" Linda shrugged. "Same reason a lot of farmers are struggling these days. Rising costs, low crop prices, medical bills from Margaret's illness. Harold's a proud man, doesn't ask for help even when he needs it. A few folks have tried, but he's stubborn. Is he still living out there?" "Far as I know, you a friend of his?" "Something like that." Dean said. "Thanks for the information." He left a $5 bill on the counter for a coffee he hadn't drunk and walked back out to his bike. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, 6 miles east on County Road 17. Dean memorized the directions and headed out. The Peterson farm appeared exactly as he remembered it, a white 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a large red barn that had faded to a soft rust color, and several outbuildings scattered across the property. But where 15 years ago the place had radiated a sense of order and prosperity, now it looked worn and tired. The paint on the house was peeling, the barn roof had missing shingles, and the fields visible from the road were overgrown with weeds instead of crops. Dean's throat tightened as he turned into the gravel driveway. He killed the engine near the house and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. What would he say? Would Harold even remember him? The front door opened and a figure stepped onto the porch. Dean's heart sank. Harold had aged far more than 15 years should account for. He was thinner, his shoulders more stooped, his hair completely white. But the eyes, those kind, weathered eyes, were the same. Harold squinted at the stranger on the motorcycle. Then his expression shifted to confusion, then to something like wonder. "Dean," he called out, his voice rough with disbelief. "Dean Crawford, is that really you?" Dean pulled off his helmet and walked toward the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Hello, Harold," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, it's me. I came to pay my debt." Harold Peterson stood frozen on his porch, one hand gripping the weathered railing as if to steady himself. For a long moment, he simply stared at Dean, his eyes searching the face of the man who stood before him, older, marked by time and the road, but unmistakably the same young man who had worked his land 15 years ago. "I'll be damned," Harold finally said, shaking his head slowly. "I never thought I'd see you again, son." Dean climbed the porch steps, and the two men faced each other in the fading afternoon light. The years stretched between them like an invisible canyon, filled with all the things that had been left unsaid. Dean extended his hand, but Harold brushed it aside and pulled him into a brief, firm embrace, the kind of hug that spoke more of relief than anger. "Come inside," Harold said, his voice gruff but warm. "You look like you've got a story to tell, and I've got time to listen." The interior of the farmhouse felt like stepping back in time, but also forward into decay. The furniture was the same, the worn couch, the rocking chair by the fireplace, the wooden dining table, but everything had a layer of dust and neglect that hadn't been there before. Photographs lined the mantel, and Dean noticed several of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Margaret, he assumed, the woman Harold had lost. "Coffee?" Harold offered, moving toward the kitchen. "Let me get it," Dean said quickly. "You sit, please." Harold didn't argue, which told Dean more about the man's condition than words could have. The Harold he remembered would have insisted on serving his guest. Dean found the coffee pot and started brewing a fresh pot, noticing as he did that the cupboards were barely stocked. Some canned goods, a half-empty box of crackers, not much else. When he returned to the living room with 2 mugs, Harold was sitting in his rocking chair, staring out the window at the fields beyond. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology," Dean began, sitting on the couch. "And I owe you money. $2,800 plus 15 years of interest. I calculated it at 5% annual interest, which comes to about $4,300 total. I have it. Cash. In my saddlebag." Harold turned to look at him, his expression unreadable. "You came all this way to pay a debt you didn't even know you still owed?" "I knew," Dean said quietly. I forgot. And that's worse than never intending to pay at all. You trusted me, Harold. You gave me work and food and a place to stay when I had nothing. And I left without paying you back. That's been eating at me since the moment I saw the sign for Plainview." Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. You always were a stubborn one, proud too. I remember thinking that about you when you first showed up. Too proud to accept charity, but desperate enough to accept honest work. You gave me more than work, Dean said. You gave me respect when I didn't deserve it. Everyone deserves respect until they prove otherwise, Harold replied. And you never proved otherwise. You worked hard every day you were here. When you left that note saying you had a family emergency, I didn't doubt you. Life happens, son. People have to make choices. I never held it against you. The kindness in Harold's voice made Dean's chest tighten. I should have sent the money. I should have kept in touch. Should-haves don't change what is, Harold said. But I appreciate you coming back. That says more about who you are than a debt ever could. They drank their coffee in silence for a moment. Dean studied the older man, noticing details he hadn't seen from a distance. The tremor in Harold's hands, the hollowness in his cheeks, the way he seemed to sit, as if every bone in his body ached. Linda at the diner said you've been having trouble. Dean said carefully, said you might lose the farm. Harold's jaw tightened, and for the first time Dean saw anger flicker across his face. Small-town gossip, he muttered. Everyone thinks they know everyone else's business. Is it true? Harold sighed, setting down his coffee mug. It's complicated. After Margaret got sick, the medical bills piled up. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Cancer treatment is expensive, even with Medicare. We had to take out loans against the farm, and then crop prices dropped. Fertilizer costs went through the roof. Equipment broke down. He trailed off, staring at his hands. I'm behind on the loan payments. Bank gave me an extension, but that runs out in 6 weeks. If I can't come up with $18,000 by then, they'll foreclose. Dean felt like he'd been punched in the gut. 18,000? Give or take, Harold said. Might as well be 18 million for all the good it does me. The fields aren't planted. I couldn't afford seed this year. The equipment's mostly broken down, and I don't have the money or the strength to fix it. I've been trying to sell off some of the machinery, but buyers are scarce. Everyone around here is in the same boat. What about your kids? Don't you have family? Harold shook his head. Margaret and I never had children. Tried for years, but it just didn't happen. We had each other, and that was enough. But now, he looked around the empty house. Now it's just me. The weight of Harold's loneliness pressed down on the room like a physical presence. Dean thought about his own life, constantly moving, never putting down roots, always running from the possibility of attachment and loss. But at least he had choice in his solitude. Harold's had been forced upon him by death and circumstance. Let me help, Dean said suddenly. I've got the money I owe you, plus more saved up. I've been working steady for years, and I don't have many expenses. I could... No, Harold interrupted, his voice firm. I appreciate the offer, Dean. I really do. But I'm not taking charity. Never have, never will. It's not charity, it's paying back what I owe and helping a friend. 4,000 won't even make a dent in 18, Harold pointed out, and I won't take more than what's owed. Dean leaned forward, his mind racing. There had to be a way. He couldn't just walk away, not now. What if I worked for it, like before? You hire me, I help you fix up the place, get it ready to sell. At least then you'd get a better price for the property. Or better yet, we plant a late crop, fix the equipment, get things running again. It's not too late in the season. Harold looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and skepticism. Dean, that's kind of you to offer. But I can't pay you. I just told you. I'm broke. Room and board, Dean said, like before. And I've got savings. I can cover supplies. We'll consider it an investment. When the farm sells, or when we harvest, we split the profits, fair and square. That's not fair at all, Harold said. You'd be taking all the risk. You took a risk on me 15 years ago, Dean countered. Let me return the favor. Harold studied him for a long moment, his weathered face showing every one of his 67 years. Dean could see the pride warring with the desperation, the stubborn independence that rural farmers were known for, fighting against the practical reality of his situation. "Why?" Harold finally asked. "Why would you do this? You don't owe me anything beyond that 4,000, and I'm not even asking for that." Dean took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "When I was here 15 years ago, I was lost. Angry at the world, angry at my family, angry at myself. I didn't know who I was or what I was supposed to do with my life. You showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it. You treated me with respect when I hadn't earned it, and you trusted me even though you had no reason to." He paused, his voice growing rougher. "After I left here, things got worse before they got better. My sister almost died. My mother did die. And there were times when I wanted to just give up, to disappear into a bottle or a needle like they did. But I didn't. You know why? Because I kept thinking about those 3 months here, about how you lived your life with integrity and honor, about how you built something real with your own hands and didn't complain when things got hard. You showed me that there was another way to live." Dean met Harold's eyes. "I became a better man because of the time I spent here. My sister's been clean for 10 years now. She's married, has 2 kids, runs a bakery in Tulsa. I ride with a brotherhood that does charity work and helps veterans. I'm not perfect, but I'm not the angry, lost kid I was when I showed up here. So when you ask me why I'd help you, the answer is simple. Because you helped me, even though you didn't know you were doing it." Silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the mantel. Harold's eyes were wet, and he blinked rapidly, clearing his throat. "Margaret would have liked you," he said finally, his voice thick. "She always said I was too quick to help strangers, that someday it would bite me in the ass. But I told her, 'Maggie, what's the point of having more than you need if you can't help someone who has less?' She'd roll her eyes at me, but she'd always make an extra plate for whoever I brought home." He smiled at the memory, then looked back at Dean. "She was the strong one, you know. People thought I was the backbone of this farm, but it was her. When she got sick, I felt like the whole world was falling apart, and when she died..." He trailed off, unable to finish. "I'm sorry," Dean said. "I wish I could have met her." "She would have remembered you," Harold said. "I told her about the young man who worked here that summer. She asked about you sometimes, wondered if you ever made it wherever you were going." "I did," Dean said. "And now I'm here again. So let me help, Harold, please. Let me repay the debt I owe, not just in money, but in time and work. Let me help you save this place." Harold rocked back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window where the sun was setting over his fields. Fields that had been in his family for 3 generations, fields that had fed his family and given meaning to his life, fields that now stood empty and overgrown. 6 weeks, he said finally. "The bank gave me 6 weeks. There's no way we can raise 18,000 in that time, even if we had a miracle crop." "Then we'll find another way," Dean said. "We'll fix up the property, sell some equipment, maybe reach out to neighboring farms to see if they need help with harvest in exchange for cash. Whatever it takes. But we don't give up." Harold looked at him, and for the first time since Dean had arrived, he saw something other than resignation in the old man's eyes. He saw a flicker of hope. "You're as stubborn as I remember," Harold said, but there was warmth in his voice. "All right. We'll try. I don't know if it'll make a difference, but we'll try. Room and board, like you said. The room above the barn is still there. Needs cleaning, but it's weatherproof." Dean stood and extended his hand. This time, Harold took it, and they shook. A firm grip that sealed an agreement between 2 men who understood what a handshake meant. "We start tomorrow morning," Dean said. "First thing, we make a list of what needs doing and what we have to work with." Harold nodded. "Dawn comes early on a farm." "I remember," Dean said with a small smile. As the last light faded from the sky, Dean retrieved his saddlebags from his motorcycle and carried them toward the barn. The building loomed dark against the twilight. And when he pulled open the door, the smell of old hay and dust greeted him. He climbed the stairs to the loft room where he had stayed 15 years ago, finding it exactly as he remembered, a simple space with a cot, a small table, and a window overlooking the farmyard. Dean dropped his bags and stood at the window, looking out at the darkening landscape. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The sound was lonely and wild, echoing across the plains. It reminded him of the life he had been living, always moving, always alone, always searching for something he couldn't name. But standing here in this familiar place, with a purpose and a debt to repay, Dean felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon when Dean woke to the sound of a rooster crowing somewhere in the farmyard. He sat up on the narrow cot, his body stiff from yesterday's ride, and stretched. The room above the barn was chilly in the pre-dawn darkness, and he could see his breath misting in the air. September mornings in Nebraska had a bite to them that reminded him why farmers wore layers. He dressed quickly in worn jeans, a flannel shirt and his boots, then descended the loft stairs. The farmyard was grey with early light, and he could see a light on in the main house. Harold was already up. Dean crossed the yard and found the older man in the kitchen brewing coffee. Harold looked marginally better than he had the day before. He'd shaved, and there was a determination in his posture that hadn't been there during their conversation. "Morning," Harold said. "Coffee's almost ready. I've got eggs and toast if you're hungry." "Sounds good," Dean said. "But let me cook. You sit." Harold opened his mouth to protest, then seemed to think better of it. He sat at the kitchen table while Dean took over, cracking eggs into a pan and popping bread into an old toaster that had probably been made in the 1970s. They ate in companionable silence, the kind that exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. After breakfast, they walked the property together as the sun rose, golden and warm, burning off the morning chill. Dean took mental notes of everything he saw, his years of mechanical work and odd jobs, giving him a practiced eye for what was salvageable and what was beyond hope. The main barn needed the roof patched and new paint, but the structure was sound. The smaller outbuildings were in worse shape. One had a partially collapsed wall, another had a door hanging off its hinges. The fencing around the property was in terrible condition, with broken posts and sagging wire that wouldn't hold livestock, even if Harold had any. "Talk me through the financial situation," Dean said as they stood at the edge of an overgrown cornfield. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Harold pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a letter from First National Bank of Nebraska. "The loan is for $42,000. Originally. I've paid down about half of that over the years, but the interest keeps adding up. Right now, I owe $24,000 total. They're willing to settle for $18 if I can pay it in a lump sum by October 10th. That's 42 days from now." Dean did the math in his head. Even with his savings and the money he owed Harold, he had maybe $8,000 available. They needed to come up with at least 10 more. "What assets do you have that we could sell?" "There's the old tractor, 1995 John Deere. Needs engine work, but it runs. Might get $3,000 for it if we can find a buyer. There's also some smaller equipment in the barn, tillers, seeders, that sort of thing. Problem is, everyone around here is trying to sell equipment, not buy it. What about the house and land itself? What's it worth?" Appraiser said about $120,000, maybe $130 if the market's good. But that's if everything's in decent shape. Right now, in this condition, we'd be lucky to get 90. Dean thought for a moment. What if we fixed it up, made it more attractive to buyers? Fresh paint, repairs, landscaping. We could easily add 20 or 30,000 to the value. "That takes time and money," Harold pointed out. "We've got one, but not the other." "We've got my savings and my labor," Dean said. "And we've got your knowledge of this place. What else do we have? Are there any crops at all we could salvage or sell?" Harold shook his head. No crops this year. The fields have been fallow. I couldn't afford the seed, and even if I could, I don't have the strength to work them alone." They walked back toward the barn, and Dean noticed something he hadn't seen the day before, an old pickup truck covered with a tarp in one of the outbuildings. What about that? 1987 Ford F-150, Harold said, was Margaret's truck. Still runs, actually. One of the few things around here that does. Could we use it to haul equipment or materials? I suppose. Why? Dean's mind was working through possibilities. Here's what I'm thinking. We focus on quick wins, things that will generate cash or add value without eating up too much time or money. We clean up the property, make cosmetic improvements to the house and barn. We sell the smaller equipment we don't need. We reach out to neighboring farms and offer our labor for harvest season. A lot of operations need extra hands right now, and they pay cash. Between that and fixing up the place, we might be able to raise enough to either save the farm or sell it for a price that covers your debt and leaves you with something to live on. Harold looked skeptical, but willing to try. It's a long shot. Long shots are better than no shots, Dean replied. They spent the rest of the morning making lists and prioritizing tasks. Dean rode his motorcycle into town and bought supplies, paint, lumber, nails, fencing wire, using a credit card and grimacing at the balance. He'd worry about paying it off later. Right now, Harold needed help, and that was what mattered. Over the next week, they fell into a rhythm. Dean worked from dawn until well after dusk, while Harold did what he could given his age and declining health. Dean repaired the barn roof, patched walls, and fixed the fencing. He painted the exterior of the house, a job that took 3 full days and left his arms and shoulders aching. Harold focused on lighter tasks, sorting through equipment, making phone calls to potential buyers, and cooking meals for both of them. In the evenings after the work was done, they would sit on the porch and talk. Harold told stories about his life with Margaret, about the early years when they had struggled to make the farm profitable, about the good seasons and the bad ones, about the community that had once thrived in Plainview but was now slowly disappearing as young people moved away. Dean, in turn, shared his own story, the years after he had left Nebraska, the struggle to keep his sister clean, the jobs he had worked, the places he had seen. He talked about the Iron Brotherhood and the code they lived by, respect, loyalty, and service to others. He talked about the freedom of the road, but also the loneliness that came with never staying in one place long enough to call it home. "Do you ever want to settle down?" Harold asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the fields. Dean thought about the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I don't know what that would look like for me. I've been moving for so long, I'm not sure I know how to stay still." "Staying still isn't the same as being stuck," Harold said. "Margaret used to tell me that. She said roots aren't chains. They're what keep you grounded when the storms come. And Lord knows, storms always come." The wisdom in Harold's words stayed with Dean as he worked. He found himself thinking about roots, about what it meant to build something lasting versus just passing through. The farm itself was a testament to that. 3 generations of Petersons had worked this land, had poured their sweat and blood into it, had raised families and built a life here. It meant something. It mattered. By the end of the second week, the property was starting to look like a proper farm again. The house gleamed with fresh white paint, the barn's roof was solid, and the fencing was secure. Dean had even managed to coax the old John Deere tractor back to life with some mechanical work, increasing its resale value significantly. They had sold some of the smaller equipment to a farm supply store in a neighboring town, raising about $1,200. Dean had also reached out to several farms in the area, offering their labor for the upcoming harvest. 2 had taken him up on the offer, a corn operation about 10 miles south, and a soybean farm to the west. The work would be grueling, but it would pay $3,000 for 2 weeks of labor. Between Dean's savings, the equipment sales, and the harvest work, they were slowly closing the gap. but they were still about $4,000 short of the $18,000 needed. "We need to think creatively," Dean said one evening as they reviewed their finances. "There has to be something else." Harold was quiet for a moment. "There is one thing," he said reluctantly, "but I don't know if I can do it." "What?" "Margaret's wedding ring and a few other pieces of jewelry she had. They're worth maybe $3,000, possibly more. I've been keeping them in a safety deposit box at the bank. I always thought, I don't know what I thought, that I'd pass them on to someone someday, I guess, but there's no one to pass them to." Dean could see the pain in Harold's face, the weight of letting go of the last tangible pieces of his wife. "We don't have to do that," he said gently. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Harold said. "Not if we want to save this place, and Margaret would understand. She'd want me to do whatever it took to keep the farm. She loved this place as much as I did." "Are you sure?" Harold nodded, though his eyes were wet. "I'm sure. The memories aren't in the jewelry, they're in here." He tapped his chest. "And no bank can take those away." The next day, they drove into town in Margaret's old F-150. Harold retrieved the jewelry from the safety deposit box, and they took it to an appraiser. The man offered $3,500 for the lot, a fair price, though it felt like robbery to Dean, seeing the way Harold's hands trembled as he handed over the small velvet boxes. With that money, plus the harvest work Dean would be doing, they would have just enough to reach the $18,000 goal. It would be tight, with no room for error or unexpected expenses, but it was possible. "We're going to make this work," Dean told Harold as they drove back to the farm. "I promise you." Harold stared out the window at the passing landscape, the endless fields, the big sky, the land he had known his entire life. "You're a good man, Dean Crawford," he said quietly. "Better than you give yourself credit for." Dean didn't respond, but the words settled into him like seeds planted in fertile soil. Maybe Harold was right. Maybe he was better than he thought. Or maybe he was just finally becoming the man he had always wanted to be. The third week of September brought cooler temperatures and the beginning of harvest season across rural Nebraska. Dean woke before dawn on Monday morning, dressed in his work clothes, and drove the F-150 south to the Johnson farm, where he would be spending the next 2 weeks helping to bring in the corn crop. YouTube. The Johnson operation was significantly larger than Harold's farm, over 800 acres of prime farmland with modern equipment and a full-time crew of 5 workers. Tom Johnson, the owner, was a stocky man in his early 50s with sun-weathered skin and a no-nonsense attitude. "You ever run a combine?" Tom asked when Dean arrived. "No, but I'm a fast learner," Dean replied. Tom grunted. "I'll put you on the grain cart for now. Follow the combine, catch the corn when it unloads, then haul it to the grain bins. Straightforward work, but it's long days. We're talking 12 to 14 hours, sometimes more if the weather holds." Dean nodded. He had expected as much. Harvest was a race against time and weather. Every farmer knew that a sudden rainstorm or early frost could destroy a crop worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. YouTube. The work was indeed grueling. Dean drove the grain cart, a large wagon with a hydraulic arm that positioned itself under the combine's unloading auger, back and forth across the fields. The combine, a massive machine that looked like something from a science fiction movie, would fill the cart with golden corn kernels in a matter of minutes. Dean would then drive to the grain bins and unload, then return for another load, over and over, hour after hour. By the end of the first day, his back ached, his hands were blistered, and his clothes were covered in corn dust. But he had earned $150, and more importantly, he had proven himself capable. Tom Johnson was a man of few words, but when he said good work at the end of the day, Dean knew he meant it. While Dean worked the harvest, Harold continued to improve the farm. Despite his age and health issues, the older man had found a renewed sense of purpose. He spent his days cleaning out the barn, organizing tools and maintaining the cosmetic improvements Dean had made. He also reached out to a real estate agent in town, just in case they needed to sell the property after all. The agent, a friendly woman named Susan Whitmore, came out to appraise the farm. After walking the property and taking photos, she delivered her assessment. "With the improvements you've made, I'd list this at $115,000, she said. "It's a fair price for the current market. The challenge is finding a buyer. Rural properties are a tough sell right now. Not a lot of young people going into farming, and corporate operations are buying up land, but usually in larger parcels." "How long would it take to sell?" Harold asked. Susan hesitated. "Hard to say. Could be a month, could be 6. Real estate moves slowly out here." "We don't have 6 months," Harold said. "We have 3 weeks." Susan's expression turned sympathetic. "Then you might have to consider accepting a lower offer if one comes in. I'll do my best to market it aggressively, but I want you to have realistic expectations." After she left, Harold sat on the porch, feeling the weight of defeat pressing down on him. He had lived his entire life on this farm. The thought of losing it or having to sell it in a desperate rush for less than it was worth felt like losing Margaret all over again. But he couldn't give up. Not with Dean working so hard to help him. The young man, though not so young anymore, had come back after 15 years to honor a debt that Harold himself had forgotten. That kind of integrity was rare. It deserved to be matched. Harold picked up the phone and started making calls. He reached out to old friends and acquaintances, people he had known for decades in the community. He swallowed his pride and asked if anyone was looking to buy land, or if they knew of any opportunities for work or income. Most of the responses were sympathetic but unhelpful. Everyone was struggling in their own way. But then he called Frank Morrison, an old friend who ran a cattle operation about 20 miles north. Frank had always been a straight shooter, and he listened carefully as Harold explained his situation. "I might have something for you," Frank said after a pause. "I'm partnering with a few other ranchers to do a community cattle sale next month. We pool our cattle together and sell in bulk to buyers from out of state. It's more profitable than selling individually. The problem is logistics. We need people to help transport and manage the cattle. It's 2 days of work, but it pays well. $500 per person. You interested?" "I'm 67 years old, Frank. I don't know if I can wrangle cattle anymore." "What about that friend of yours? The one who's been helping you?" Harold thought about Dean. "He's working the Johnson harvest right now." "That ends in a few days, doesn't it? The sale is October 6th. If he's available, I could use him. And I could use you too, even if it's just checking paperwork and managing the pens. Your experience would be valuable. $500 for each of them, 1,000 total." It wasn't much in the grand scheme, but combined with everything else, it might be just enough to put them over the finish line. "We'll be there," Harold said. "Thank you, Frank." "Don't thank me yet," Frank replied. "It's hard work. But you've always been tough, Harold. You'll get through this." When Dean returned to the farm that evening, exhausted and covered in corn dust, Harold shared the news about the cattle sale. Dean's face broke into a tired smile. "That's great," he said. "Every bit helps." They sat on the porch as the sun set, eating the stew Harold had made in the slow cooker. The evening air was crisp and clear, and the stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I've been thinking," Harold said after a while, "about what happens after." "After what?" Dean asked. "After we save the farm, or after we sell it?" "Either way, what happens then? Where do you go?" Dean had been trying not to think about that question. "I don't know," he admitted. "Back on the road, I guess. There's a job waiting for me in Iowa if it's still available." "And you'll just keep moving, town to town, job to job?" "It's what I do." Harold was quiet for a moment. "You know, if we manage to save this place, I'm going to need help running it. I can't do it alone anymore. That's been made pretty clear. I could use a partner, someone who knows hard work and has integrity, someone I trust." Dean looked at the older man, surprised. "Harold, I don't know anything about farming. Not really. You know more than you think, and what you don't know, I can teach you. The bigger question is whether you want to learn, whether you want to stay." The word stay hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Dean had spent 15 years running, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. The thought of stopping, of committing to one place and one purpose, was terrifying. But it was also appealing in a way he hadn't expected. The last few weeks working alongside Harold, improving the farm, being part of something larger than himself, it had felt meaningful. It had felt like home. "I'll think about it," Dean said finally. "That's all I ask," Harold replied. The days blurred together in a haze of work and exhaustion. Dean finished the Johnson harvest, earning his $1,500, then immediately moved to the soybean farm to the west. That job paid an additional $1,200 for 10 days of work. His body ached constantly, and he fell into bed each night too tired to even think. But slowly, steadily, they were accumulating the money they needed. On October 3rd, Dean and Harold sat at the kitchen table and counted their assets. Dean's original savings, Feindive $200. Equipment sales, Hundal $200. Margaret's jewelry, $3,500. Johnson harvest work, Panda $500. Soybean harvest work, Panja $200. Cattle sale, upcoming, $1,000. Total, $14,600. They were still $3,400 short. "We're not going to make it," Harold said, the defeat evident in his voice. Dean stared at the numbers, his mind racing. There had to be something else, some other option they hadn't considered. And then it hit him. "My motorcycle," he said. Harold looked up. "What?" "My Harley. It's a 2018 Road King with custom work. I could sell it. Bikes like that go for 15 to 18,000. Easy." "Dean, no, that's your bike. That's your livelihood." "It's just a machine," Dean said, though the words hurt to say. His Road King had been with him for 7 years, had carried him across 48 states, had been his constant companion and his only home. But it was replaceable. Harold's farm and the old man's dignity and future were not. "I can't let you do that," Harold said firmly. "You're not letting me do anything," Dean replied. "I'm making a choice. Besides, if your offer still stands about staying and helping run the farm, then I won't need a bike for a while. I'll be here." Harold's eyes widened. "You're saying yes, you'll stay?" "I'm saying I'll try," Dean said. "I don't know if I'll be any good at it. I don't know if I can handle being in one place, but you gave me a chance 15 years ago when no one else would. The least I can do is return the favor." Harold stood and walked around the table, pulling Dean into a tight embrace. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you, son." Dean returned the hug, feeling something shift inside him, a letting go of the past and a tentative opening toward the future. The next day, Dean listed his motorcycle online and through the Iron Brotherhood network. Within 48 hours, he had 3 serious offers. He accepted one for $16,000, less than the bike was worth, but more than enough for their needs. When the buyer came to pick up the Harley, Dean walked him through all the custom features, the maintenance history, everything the new owner would need to know. And then he watched as the man rode away on the bike that had been Dean's home and identity for so many years. It hurt more than he had expected. But as he turned back toward the farmhouse, where Harold stood on the porch watching, Dean felt something else too. He felt free. Not the freedom of the road and endless movement, but a different kind of freedom. The freedom that came from making a choice, from committing to something, from finally stopping the endless running and standing still. October 10th arrived with a cold, grey morning that threatened rain. Dean woke early and dressed carefully, not in his usual work clothes, but in the one nice button-down shirt and clean jeans he owned. Today was the day they would go to the bank and settle Harold's debt one way or another. Harold was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the financial documents spread out before him. He looked older this morning, the strain of the last few weeks visible in the lines of his face. "Morning," Dean said, pouring himself a coffee. "You sleep?" "Not much," Harold admitted. "Kept thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if the bank won't accept the payment? What if there are hidden fees we didn't account for? What if—" "We'll deal with whatever comes," Dean interrupted gently. "We've done everything we can. That has to be enough." Harold nodded, but his hands trembled slightly as he gathered the papers. They had raised $17,800, still $200 short of the $18,000 the bank had requested. Dean had debated selling some of his tools to make up the difference, but Harold had insisted they present what they had and negotiate if necessary. They drove into Plainview in Margaret's old F-150, neither man speaking much. The town was quiet on this Wednesday morning. A few people on the sidewalks, some trucks parked outside the feed store, but mostly just the stillness of rural Nebraska. First National Bank sat on Main Street, a solid brick building that had been there since 1952. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and floor polish. The teller, a young woman Dean didn't recognize, directed them to the office of Robert Chen, the loan officer handling Harold's account. Chen was a slim man in his 40s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He shook hands with both of them and gestured for them to sit. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his tone professional but not unkind. "I understand you're here to discuss your loan situation." "I'm here to settle it," Harold said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "We have $17,800, cash. I know that's $200 short of what we discussed, but it's everything we could raise. I'm hoping we can work something out for the remaining balance." Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. He opened a folder on his desk and reviewed the documents inside. "Mr. Peterson, I have to be honest. When we spoke 6 weeks ago, I didn't expect you to be able to raise even half of this amount. The fact that you've come up with nearly $18,000 is remarkable. May I ask how you managed it?" "Hard work," Harold said simply, gesturing to Dean. "And good friends. This is Dean Crawford. He's been helping me get the farm back in order." Chen studied Dean for a moment, then returned his attention to Harold. "The bank's policy is clear. We agreed on $18,000 as a settlement figure. However, given your history with this bank and given the extraordinary effort you've clearly made, I think we can show some flexibility." Harold leaned forward. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that $200, in the context of a $24,000 debt that we're already settling at a significant reduction, is negligible. The bank's primary concern is recovering as much of the loan as possible and avoiding foreclosure, which is expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved. If you can commit to paying the remaining $200 within 30 days, I'm authorized to accept your payment today and mark the loan as satisfied." Dean saw Harold's shoulders sag with relief, and he felt his own tension ease. They had done it. Against all odds, with hard work and sacrifice, they had saved the farm. "30 days is no problem," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "We can do that." "Excellent," Chen said, pulling out forms. "I'll need you to sign here and here, and I'll need to count the cash, of course, for verification." The process took another hour, counting money, signing documents, having everything notarized. But finally, Chen stamped a document with "paid in full, pending final balance," and handed Harold a copy. "Congratulations, Mr. Peterson," he said, shaking Harold's hand. "You should be proud of what you've accomplished here." Harold's eyes were wet as they left the bank, and once they were outside, he had to stop and lean against the truck for a moment, overcome with emotion. Dean stood beside him, saying nothing, just being present. "We did it." Harold finally said, his voice breaking. "Dear God, we actually did it." "You did it," Dean corrected. "You fought for this place. I just helped." "No," Harold said firmly, turning to face him. "We did it together. I couldn't have done this without you, Dean. I'd have lost everything. The farm, Margaret's memory, my dignity, all of it. You saved me. You saved this place." Dean felt his own throat tighten. "You saved me first," he said quietly. 15 years ago, and again now. You gave me something to fight for besides myself." They drove back to the farm in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared struggle and victory. When they pulled into the driveway, both men sat for a moment, just looking at the property. The white farmhouse with its fresh paint, the sturdy barn, the fields that stretched toward the horizon. "What now?" Harold finally asked. "Now we work," Dean said. "We've got a farm to run, and I've got a lot to learn." That evening, they celebrated with a simple dinner, steaks from the local butcher, baked potatoes, and green beans from a neighbor's garden. They sat on the porch as the sun set, drinking beer from bottles and talking about the future. "We'll need to plant next spring," Harold said. "Corn and soybeans, probably. I've got contacts for seed suppliers, and if we apply for a small operating loan, the bank should approve it now that the property's clear." "What about equipment?" Dean asked. "The tractor's good, but we'll need more for a full planting season." "We can rent what we don't have," Harold said, "or partner with neighbors. A lot of small operations share equipment these days to keep costs down." They talked logistics and plans, but underneath the practical discussions was a deeper understanding. They were building something together, not just saving a farm, but creating a partnership based on mutual respect and trust. Over the following weeks, word spread through Plainview about what Harold and Dean had accomplished. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate them, and Susan Whitmore called to say she'd taken down the listing since they were keeping the property. The community, which had watched Harold struggle in silence for so long, seemed relieved that one of their own had managed to hold on. One afternoon in late October, as Dean was repairing a section of fence, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. 3 men got out, all wearing leather vests with patches. Dean recognized them immediately, members of the Iron Brotherhood from the Cheyenne chapter. "Dean Crawford," called out the man in front, a grizzled rider named Rick Patterson who served as the chapter's road captain. "Heard you sold your bike. Thought we'd ride out and check on you, make sure you hadn't lost your mind." Dean grinned and walked over to greet them, clasping hands and exchanging the Brotherhood's traditional greeting. "I'm good, Rick. Better than good, actually." Harold came out of the house, curious about the visitors. Dean introduced them, and soon they were all sitting on the porch, drinking coffee and talking. Dean explained the situation, the debt, the farm, the decision to stay and help Harold. Rick listened carefully, then nodded with approval. "You honored an old debt and helped a brother in need. That's what the code's about. The bike doesn't make the man's choices do. You made the right one. Doesn't mean we won't give you grief about being a farmer now instead of a biker," one of the other men, Carlos Martinez, added with a laugh. "Who says I can't be both?" Dean replied. "Plenty of farmers ride. Besides, Harold and I have been talking about getting a used bike for farm errands once we've got the spring planting done. Nothing fancy, but something reliable." The brothers stayed for a few hours, and before they left, Rick pulled Dean aside. "You've got a place with us whenever you need it," he said. "Brotherhood doesn't end just because you're not on the road. You settle here, put down roots, that's fine. But you're still one of us. Don't forget that." "I won't," Dean promised. As November arrived, the landscape transformed. The fields turned brown and dormant, preparing for winter. Harold and Dean spent their days preparing for the cold months ahead, winterizing equipment, stocking firewood, insulating the barn. They also began planning for spring planting, researching crop prices and market trends. calculating what they could afford and what would be most profitable. Dean found himself adapting to farm life more easily than he'd expected. The work was hard and the days were long, but there was a rhythm to it that appealed to him. Unlike the transient nature of his previous life, where every job was temporary and every connection fleeting, here he was building something that would last. Every fence he repaired would still be standing next year. Every improvement he made to the property would pay dividends in seasons to come. Harold, for his part, seemed years younger. Having Dean there had given him not just physical help, but a renewed sense of purpose. He took on the role of teacher with enthusiasm, sharing decades of farming knowledge and rural wisdom. They developed an easy partnership, each understanding their strengths and compensating for the other's weaknesses. On Thanksgiving Day, they were invited to Frank Morrison's ranch for dinner with several other farming families from the area. Dean felt awkward at first. He was the outsider, the biker who'd suddenly become a farmer, but the community welcomed him warmly. These were people who understood hard work and keeping your word, and they respected what he'd done for Harold. During dinner, Frank stood and raised his glass. "I want to make a toast," he said. "To Harold Peterson, who showed us all what determination looks like, and to Dean Crawford, who proved that integrity isn't dead in this world. You two remind us why we stick with farming even when it's hard, because the land and the people are worth fighting for." The room echoed with agreement, and Dean felt something settle in his chest, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since he was a child, before his family had fallen apart. As December arrived and winter set in, Dean and Harold settled into the slower pace of off-season farm life. They spent evenings by the fireplace, Harold sharing stories about Margaret and the early years of their marriage, Dean talking about his years on the road and the people he'd met. Sometimes they played chess or cards, other times they just sat in comfortable silence, reading or planning for spring. One evening, as snow fell gently outside the windows, Harold brought out a wooden box from his bedroom. Inside were photographs spanning decades, Harold and Margaret as newlyweds, pictures of the farm in its prime, images of community events and celebrations. "I want you to understand the history of this place," Harold said. "If we're going to be partners, you should know what you're part of. This farm has been in the Peterson family since 1947. My grandfather bought it after he came back from World War II, built that barn with his own hands. My father took it over in 1969 and expanded it. I inherited it in 1992 when he passed. And now," he paused, looking at Dean. "Now it's ours, both of ours." Dean felt the weight of that statement. "Harold, I can't—" "Yes, you can," Harold interrupted. "I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't have children. I don't have family beyond some distant cousins I haven't seen in 20 years. You came back to honor a debt and you saved this place. More than that, you gave me a reason to keep fighting. As far as I'm concerned, you're family now. And when I'm gone, this farm should go to you." "I don't know what to say," Dean said honestly. "Say you'll take care of it," Harold replied. "Say you'll respect what it means and continue the work. That's all I ask." "I will," Dean promised. "I swear it." They shook hands, and in that moment, a new chapter began, not just for the farm, but for both men. Christmas arrived quietly. Dean and Harold cut down a small pine tree from the edge of the property and decorated it with ornaments that had belonged to Margaret. On Christmas Eve, they attended the community service at the small church in Plainview, sitting among families that had known the Petersons for generations. After the service, as they drove home under a sky brilliant with stars, Harold spoke quietly. "Margaret would have liked you, you know. She always said I needed to stop trying to do everything myself, that I needed to let people in. I was too stubborn to listen when she was alive, but I hear her now." "I think I would have liked her too," Dean said. "She'd be happy about what we've done here, about saving the farm, about you staying." She always believed things worked out the way they were supposed to, even when it didn't seem like it at the time. Dean thought about the twisted path that had brought him back to this place. His father's death, his sister's addiction, his years of wandering, the chance recognition of a road sign. Maybe Margaret had been right. Maybe things did work out the way they were supposed to. As the new year approached, Dean found himself reflecting on the journey. 15 years ago, he had been a lost young man, angry and directionless, running from pain and responsibility. He had stumbled into Plainview by accident, had been shown kindness by a stranger, and had left with a debt unpaid and quickly forgotten. But that debt, and the man who had given it, had never really left him. It had shaped who he became, had influenced the code he lived by, had been part of the foundation on which he built his integrity. And when fate had brought him back, he'd been given the chance to not just repay money, but to save a man's legacy and find his own purpose in the process. On New Year's Eve, Dean and Harold sat on the porch despite the cold, bundled in heavy coats and watching their breath mist in the air. The stars were impossibly bright, the Milky Way a river of light across the black sky. "What are you thinking about?" Harold asked. "Home," Dean said. "I've been on the road for 15 years, looking for something I couldn't name, and the whole time home was here, waiting for me to be ready for it." Harold nodded. "Home isn't always a place you're born. Sometimes it's a place you choose, and sometimes it chooses you." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars and listening to the wind whisper across the frozen fields. In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of fireworks from town as midnight approached and a new year began. "Thank you," Dean said finally, "for trusting me all those years ago, for giving me a second chance now, for letting me be part of something that matters." "Thank you for coming back," Harold replied, "for honoring your word, for fighting for this place when I didn't think I had any fight left in me, for giving me hope." As the clock struck midnight, somewhere in the distance, church bells rang out, celebrating the arrival of a new year. But on the Peterson farm, two men sat in peaceful silence, knowing that they had already received the greatest gift, redemption, purpose, and the knowledge that debts of honor, when finally paid, could transform both the giver and the receiver. The road that had brought Dean Crawford back to Nebraska had been long and winding, but it had led him exactly where he needed to be. Not just to repay a forgotten debt, but to discover that sometimes the greatest journey isn't about how far you travel, but about finding the courage to stop running and finally come home. And as the winter stars wheeled overhead and the frozen earth rested beneath them, the farm that 3 generations of Petersons had built and one drifting biker had helped to save stood solid and enduring, a testament to the power of integrity, the value of second chances, and the unbreakable bonds forged between two men who had learned that family isn't always about blood, but about the promises we keep and the burdens we choose to share.